All three issues seem to be plaguing society also, society at large. We started in winter of 2013, so about 10 years. And back then when we started, one of the very first things we started addressing was just racial disunity within the United States and Evansville in general. And we would hold talks, and typically when we held a talk or a seminar, we'd blast it on Facebook, make flyers, invite people out, and our typical turnout was this. If we had this many people, it was actually a really, really good, it was a great seminar. Then comes the trifecta of 2020. That's what I call it, the trifecta of 2020. We had a MoRR, we had Breonna Taylor, and of course we had Floyd. And all of a sudden, I'm meeting with, at least for about 3 months around that time, I was averaging about 3 to 4 leaders in different fields a day. Just calls and, hey, Ubi, we've heard about you, we heard you've been addressing this issue for the last 10 years. Could we just have coffee? Or will you be willing to come to my office and meet with my staff? We just want to talk with someone that's safe to help us understand how to think through this and what's going on. And for us, well, for me, it was kind of affirming, but at the same time disappointing, because I was like, man, we've been holding this for 10 years, and hardly anyone's showing up, and now we're getting calls after calls. And interestingly, most of the calls were, could we meet in person? It was never something, could we have a general thing? And we had a number of people actually share and say, hey, I really wanted to come to your events, but I was afraid that if I came and I said something, I'd be canceled. I didn't want to come across as insensitive or racist, and so nobody wanted to touch it. And I'm like I said, we're a Christian organization, so I'm not just talking, leaders of school corps or leaders of businesses or leaders of nonprofits. I'm talking about pastors also. Even pastors were afraid to show up at this event. The reason I share that is to say, obviously we all recognize that racial disharmony, racial disunity is a major problem in the United States and the world over. And it's basically something we don't want to touch, right? Now, like I said, I run a Christian organization, so a lot of what I'm going to say is Christian. For those of you that are Christians, yay! For those of you who are not Christians, darn it, we want to get converted. I promise I can respect your space. That's not going to happen. But the reason why I bring that up is to say, if you're a non-Christian, don't feel threatened by what you hear, just contextualize it, right? When I work, I've worked with different kind of people, so I've been in different kind of settings, and I have people say things all the time, or talk on things all the time where their philosophy is different, or their worldview is different from mine. I don't think that what they have to say is of no benefit. What I simply do is take what they say and contextualize it to my reality. And 9 out of 10 times I discover that I'm actually better off listening and applying what they said. I just have to do the work of contextualizing it. So I really challenge you guys to do that. But at the same time, I'm going to do everything in my power to use very little Christianese, right? But I just thought I'd give you that as a preface. So our approach to, when we look at racial reconciliation within the context of American, or just the racial divide within the context of America, it's really interesting, because what we have found is that the narrative of the culture, news, media, and otherwise, is very different from the Christian narrative on racial divide. And I tend to think that the Christian narrative is more consistent. That the Christian narrative is more consistent with reality and more consistent with what we perceive, right? So I'll start with this. When you think about racial disharmony in the United States, right? It's really interesting to consider the fact that the approach has always been the same consistently, right? We go back to the civil rights era, go back to Jim Crow. When you look at how America has addressed racial disharmony, it's always been consistent, and it's always been an appeal to law and policy. Every time, right? On a national scale, on a local scale, and on a corporate scale, right? Corporations, nonprofits, the minute we look at this issue, what we start thinking is, what laws and policies can we put in place to correct this, right? And what that actually reveals is that we have this unspoken assumption, right, that the law and policy has the capacity to correct human behavior and make it better. Right? Like we actually think whether we own it or not, on a subconscious level at least, we believe that laws and policies actually have the ability to correct things. And I think the clearest example is actually the 1960s, right? Out of that time we had the Civil Rights, right? Civil Rights Act, housing, fair housing, equal employment opportunity, the immigration, I mean, like, you name it, right? In the 60s, all these acts were passed. And interestingly, when you look at the conversation around racial disunity in America today, they're all still centered around those four problems. Politics, right, redistricting, housing, we see reports, consistent reports of minorities either not getting fair value on their houses or being asked to pay a whole lot more. Equal employment opportunity, we've seen the research that's come out on hiring minorities versus majorities. But I don't know if you guys read the story about resumes being changed, the names of resumes being changed, but the name, but the content of the, okay, you guys are familiar with that research, right? And then it was tweaked. So the issues we are facing still center around those laws and policies that were passed at least 5 decades ago. Right, so we fast forward to 2020, right, and we see everything that's happening, and we immediately fall back to that again. So we come up with this, so we start to debate defund police versus whatever. Okay, wherever you stand on the issue, that's not the point. The point, the point is that it's not where we stand on the issue. The point I'm making is that our default is to immediately observe, research, study, listen, and then say, what policies or laws can we pass to correct the issue?
And you may describe why this is the case, but do you feel like that for people, it gives them something very concrete and easy to go after, they readily identify with, whether it's a political party, whether it's like, oh, I can hang on this issue and not have to explore things deeper, or I'm sure you'll probably describe your thoughts about why, but I'm kind of curious about that, because you're right. I mean, we go after something that's concrete, and right. we often strongly voice opinions about things regarding like political candidates or political issues, and yet, as you're describing, we let go of a current that goes underneath there. I'm curious your thoughts about why it's the case.
I think that has something to do with it, but I think most of it has to do with authority, right? Whether it be an institution, whether it be a government, a country, we look to the government because we know the government makes the laws and enforces the laws. So we believe that for things to be changed, they must be enforced, right? And that mentality carries over from that high government level to even individual levels. Like, what do I need to do? What laws can be put in place to check me? Or what laws can I'm a parent, I do it all the time. I tell my kids, hey, from this point on, you're wake up at 5 a.m. until I find that I can't go to bed at 1 a.m. I'm waking up at 5, so we need to change that law again, right? But so I think I think a lot of it has to do with power, and because we recognize that the power to enforce sits with government, we think that for something to be changed, it has to be power changed, right? So we hear talk of racial justice, okay? So very simple definition, just think of justice as laws and policies that are put in place to create harmony, right? And let's keep in mind that the personification of justice are the laws and policies of an institution, of government, anywhere. You want to know a just business, look at their business. Look at their policies on paper and see how consistent what they have on paper is with what they do, right? You want to know a just government, look at the government's laws and say, oh, that's a just government, or that's a just law, this is an unjust law. So the point being that the law, right, that laws are the personification of justice. You want to tell if something is just, look at the laws. Now, let me give you guys an analogy. Imagine you go on 69, I-69, 70 miles an hour, okay?
Or more.
Or 70 miles an hour. But you happen to be going more. Yeah, you happen to be going more. Let's say you're going 90 miles an hour. Okay, 90 miles an hour. In my case, very doable. I'm just working on getting better. But you're on the I-7 and you're going 90 miles an hour, okay? And you get pulled over, okay? The person comes up and you're the officer, so you pull the person up, right? You come up and it's one of your really close friends. And you're like, yo, I didn't recognize your car. What are you doing driving at 90 miles an hour, right? And the person's like, dude, I'm sorry, I was just really test driving this car. Have you been as family? What are you gonna do? You're a police officer, the person's going 90 miles an hour, right? You come up and they're your friend. Be honest, what are you gonna do? 90 miles an hour.
Well, either you're gonna let them off completely, or you're gonna downgrade the ticket.
No options. Well,
You're gonna downgrade.
Maybe
Maybe it was 78.
right.
Right.
You know, so I asked this one time when someone said, I'm gonna write them a ticket, and I was like, they're your friend. He was like, yeah. I was like, dude, you're one out of a million. Everyone says I'm either gonna let them go, or at best I'm gonna write them a warning. Okay. So I mean, think about that. The law is, and let's not forget, the law is not just 70 miles an hour. The law is, the limit of the road is 70 miles an hour. If you infringe this law, there's a penalty. That's the full law, right? The law is not just 70 miles an hour. It's 70 miles an hour and consequences, right? There might not be enough space. You know, it's not fine print, it's invisible print. It's invisible print, right? Okay, so the second scenario, I-69 again, 70 miles an hour. You see the car going 9 miles an hour. Pull the car over, come over. Person's very respectful, very courteous. Officer, I'm so sorry. I just lost track of how fast I was going. What are you going to do? Same law, same infraction, different person. What are you going to do? Be honest.
Probably writing a ticket.
Yeah, right. We all would. So what's the difference between the first scenario and the second scenario? Friend relationship. That's it. Relationship. And we see this over and over and over again. Even with jobs, you're a human resource person. You have a friend come in, hey, don't raise your hands and don't, you know. But you're a human resource person. You have a friend who comes in for a job. Your friend is qualified for the job. Someone else comes in for the same job, and that person is just as qualified as your friend. No less qualified, just as qualified. Who are you most likely going to hire? Be honest. Right? Most likely your friend. Most likely your friend. The point to these analogies is that what we see consistently is that relationship is the custodian of law and policy. Right? Relationship is what nourishes law and policy. Relationship is what nurtures law and policy. Relationship is actually what protects law and policy. Relationship will actually determine whether law and policy will be enforced or not. Okay, I hate to admit this, but a few months ago, maybe over a year ago, I was actually pulled over, and I never tried it before. I was like, you know what, I'm going to try this time. Okay, it was a Sunday morning, I had an engagement. It was probably about 3 hours out of Evansville, north of Evansville. I'm driving, and I just literally, maybe 15 minutes out of Evansville, I get pulled over by a sheriff. And I'm like, you're kidding me, I'm going to be late. And as fast as I was like, dude, you're definitely getting a ticket. And at this point, I've been doing this workshop, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to try this. So he comes to us like, officer, I am so sorry, man, for real. I just really have an engagement. Da, 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 da. Hey, by the way, you know, my relative is one of your boys, man. He works with you guys. And he's like, oh, what's his name? Da, 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 da. He says, okay, let me go back to my car. I'm like going about 20 over. I'm going about 20 over. He goes into his car, comes back, and it's like, dude, just be careful, man. Don't be driving like that. You go ahead and get out of here. I was driving 20 over. And all I said was, oh, yeah, so, you know, his rank, his name, and I said, ah, yeah, you can go, right? We can talk about how wrong or right that is. We're not trying to change society. The point is, right, the point is that there's a principle, right? That's the point. The point is there's a principle that relationship is literally the custodian and the preserver of law and justice, right? So what happens when we put laws in place without relationship is those laws last, but eventually eventually they'll denigrate. Every time. Every time. Right? So with laws that are passed, with governmental laws, it takes longer, but what's going to happen is it's going to denigrate. It can't hold. Right? Okay, yeah. So I should hire anyone, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race. Say I should. It's in paper. It's the right thing to do. What if I can hire someone that looks like me and get away with it? I most likely will. If I'm inclined, if I'm that kind of a person, guess what I'm going to do? I'm simply going to find a way, right, to sidestep that law policy without getting caught. Right? Now don't hear that and think, oh, that person is a wicked person. I'm like, yeah, that could be wrong, but it could also be the person's just ignorant. The person could really be ignorant of their partiality. It could be their culture, it could be their leaning, it could be what they're exposed to, right? So the person, what do? We prefer what we're more familiar with, right? And when we look at racial tension, that's what we see in America. When we look at corporations, when we look at institutions, that's our typical approach. We see a problem and we say, what law? We do due diligence. We study, we research, we listen. But then the next thing we say to ourselves is, on a systemic level, what laws and policies can be put in place to correct these things? When the truth be told, we have not actually dealt with the most important thing, looking at relationships. So the cultural narrative is that the problem of race is one of inequity, right? And if it was simply an issue of inequity, then guess what all what we'd have to do? All what we'd have to do would be to pass laws and policies to address the issue. Why? Well, because there's inequality. We need to make things equal. We pass laws and then, we send out resourcing to kind of level the playing field, right? But when we look at the American landscape, what we see is, no, the prime problem is not inequity. The prime problem is loss of kinship, which is so much deeper than inequity. It's loss of kinship. What's your name?
Cassie.
It's that when I see Cassie, I don't think, oh, that's Cassie, my sister, right? Or I don't think, oh, Cassie's really cool. What I think is, Cassie is white. Cassie is different from me. Cassie is not made of the same stuff. She doesn't feel like me. She's not driven like me. She couldn't possibly aspire to the same things that I aspire to. Her reality has to be completely different because she's white and I'm black. So she's lost to me. Does that make sense? There's actually a human disconnect. I don't see her as I see myself. And because I don't see her as I see myself, it is easy for me to discriminate. As a matter of fact, discriminating against Cassie, who's different from me, becomes natural. Why? Because she's different from me. She's literally, you guys remember, and of course, thank God we don't even talk like this anymore, but remember the saying, stick with your kind? Right, kind. It's like stick with your kind. Oh wow, so they're of a different kind than I am, right? That saying actually reveals a reality that we do tend to, that there are vestiges of that kind of thinking. That when I look at a white person, they're of a different kind. When I think of a brown person, they're of a different kind. When I think of a yellow person, they're of a different kind. So that person is lost to me. And if they're lost to me, if there's a break in relationship, it becomes almost, it becomes natural and comfortable to discriminate because however they feel, it's not how I would feel. Or whatever they're suffering, they kind of deserve because they're different from me. Right? But if I think, no, this person is my brother or sister, and I see inequity, you know the natural thing the natural thing is, without being told, I start to think, how do I make equity? I see you as my kin. When I see inequity, like if I recognize you as my kin, all I have to do is convince you of inequity. If I recognize you, if you recognize me as your kin, all that's necessary is the conviction that a wrong has been done. But if you see me as different, it doesn't matter that a wrong's been done. Of course you think it's wrong, but we are different. We're different, right? So what reconciliation, so we focus on racial reconciliation, and what that is establishing friendships, establishing relationships on a systemic level, right? So what we say is, while your organization, your company, while you are working on passing laws and policies, what parallel work are you doing on a systemic level to improve ethnic relationships within your culture? Right? Like, what kind of work is going on? Because we know what it looks like to pass laws and policies, right? Get a team of very qualified people together, do the study, do the research, come in, understand the culture of a place, and then put laws and policies that can be enforced, right? And when they're enforced, you check them, and then when they're not enforced, you go back and you look what went wrong, and then you try and redo it, right? We know how laws and policies work on a systemic level. And should we do those things? Absolutely. Thank God for laws and policies. The point is not that laws and policies are wrong. The point is that they're insufficient if they're not founded on relationship. And what we find 9 out of 10 times is corporations and governments don't enforce that. They don't even think that way, as they should not. It doesn't fall within their realm of work to actually ask themselves the question, how do we make relationships better, right? That falls on us. That falls on us. I have to ask myself, how do I develop a relationship with someone else, right? I've had to ask myself, and this is a question I ask myself consistently, not like every day, but regularly, almost like a self-check. I ask myself, hey, Ubi, how many Asian friends do you have? How many, like you live in probably the most diverse country in the world. Maybe not the most diverse part of that most diverse country in the world, but, right, but nevertheless, you do live in probably the most diverse country in the world, right? So I have to ask myself the question, Ubi, what are you doing intentionally to make Asian friends and Hispanic friends and white friends? What are you intentionally and consciously doing? It's an extremely difficult question to answer. It's an extremely difficult question to answer, because the minute I ask myself that question and I start to actually inventory my day, I discover, oh my God, I'm really not doing anything consciously and intentionally to actually develop these relationships. Well, guess what? If I'm not doing anything, guess what? Those people are actually lost to me. And because they're lost to me, when they do suffer some kind of discrimination, it takes a whole lot for me to involve myself, if I even involve myself at all. Right? Now, I'm not involved, the reason for lack of involvement isn't because I'm wicked, right? The reason for lack of involvement is complete ignorance, it's lack of relationship. So, an example I'd give is, I learned how to talk to a police officer when I get pulled over because I have white friends. For real. I was born in Washington, D.C. A few years after I was born, moved back to Nigeria, came back to the States 20 years ago. Okay, and I've just had the good fortune to make friends and meet people from different ethnicities. And obviously whites are the majority here. So something so when I came back to the States, I immediately caught on to just, the racial disharmony, and oh man, you need to identify with these people because you look this way, you this, you know, it was just going on. But, you know, I was like, nope, I'm not, you know, I'm just going to open myself to the experience. So I had a lot of white friends. And I would notice that when white people got pulled over, in general, by police, it's like, hi, officer, how are you? Hey, do you know why you got pulled over? You, whatever, oh, officer, I'm so sorry, license registration, here you go, come back, kind of thing. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. But when I would write with my black friends or other minorities, I noticed that they were very uncomfortable, right? And I noticed that a lot of times, the officer acted the same way he or she acted when they were pulling over a white person. So guess what I learned? I was like, I mean, there've been a few cases, but in general, they act the same way. So guess what I said to myself? I said, okay, whenever I get pulled over, I'm gonna act like a white person. I said, and I know how they act. Why? Because I have enough friends who are white, and I've seen them get pulled over. When they get pulled over, you know, they're first, you know, they're like, darn it, I got pulled over, but they're comfortable. Hi, officer, how can I help you? So guess what I do now when I get pulled over? I call, you know, hi, officer, how can I help you? I've actually been in my car driving with some black friends, and I get pulled over, and after the cop leaves, they look at me and like, Ubi, you're weird. Do you know you just got pulled over? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, and I was like, no, you know, I had my hands on my steering and everything, but no, they're cool, that, you know. And the person was like, like, Ubi, how? I was like, well, I made friends, and I noticed that this is how they act, so that's what I did, right? And the same is true, and it's vice versa. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So you hear people say all the time, don't say, you can never understand my experience because you're not me. Does that make sense? Right. You can never understand what it is to be black because you're not black. But that's not true, right? Or if that's true, the inverse is true, which is, if you can never understand what it is to be black because you're not black, I can never understand what it is to be white because I'm not white, right? And that may be true to an extent, but there's a level of fallacy to it, which is you can know what it is to be black or brown or yellow if you build relationships with those people, if you get to know them. And guess what you discover all the time? They desire the same thing as you do. They're driven, just like you're driven. They're afraid of what you're afraid of. They want. They're just like you. But you really don't get to know that if you don't build relationship. You know, and it's kind of like working out, right? The very first time you work out, your body aches, but then you get used to it and you're like, man, I cannot imagine what my life would be like if I'm over. It's the same thing, right? So we have to do the work of building relationships. We have to do the work of building relationship. I don't know how that translates for Easterseals, but that's something I would encourage you guys to do on an individual and corporate level. You can say, okay, hey, so I'll share a story with you guys. A few years ago, I ran the day education program for the Ubi Nweto youth home. And I came in as one of the truancy. Initially, when I started working, I came in as a truancy agent. And one of the things that we did was, work with at-risk kids to get them back on track. So what I started doing was I would actually go to these kids. We typically would meet with them after school, but I started visiting them in school, observing them in class, and getting to meet with their teachers. Well, there's a particular kid who got suspended from school. So I got a call. I went home to go visit him, and we talked. And he said there's this particular teacher that he has, and he thinks that this teacher has problems with him because he's black, right? And I said, okay, and he came from he moved from a different part of the country to Evansville. And I said, okay, that's a guy. I took note of it, and a few days later, I met with his teachers, and I met with this teacher, and interestingly, the teacher that had the highest praise for this kid was that teacher. The teacher had no clue that this student had shared anything with me or reported anything. But this teacher spoke so highly of the student and said, I cannot wait to see what they turn out to be. That's this teacher talking about this kid. So at the end of the school that day, I met with the kid and we were talking. I'm like, hey, you know what? I met with about 5 of your teachers today, and they'll give me reports about you. And I said, hey, so I want to play a game with you. He said, okay. I said, I'm going to read you what they said, and I want you to tell me which teacher said this. And I read that teacher's comment, and he mentioned 4 teachers. And I said, no, and he couldn't, it didn't click that he had left out one person, because it just never occurred to him that that teacher could want something that good for him. That kid had no relationship whatsoever with the teacher and was interpreting that teacher's actions based on past trauma, past experience. Right? And that teacher, as great a teacher as they are, had not done due diligence to build some kind of relationship with the kid. So here is this teacher being hard on this kid because they want the kid to reach their potential. The kid doesn't know it because they're a kid. And the teacher doesn't know that they're failing in communicating, hey, you can be so much better, because they hadn't taken the time to build a relationship. So you have this black young kid who thinks he's being discriminated against because his teacher is white. And that's just one example. That's just one example. Right? Now, so again, you guys will actually have to contextualize that, right? But before I go any further, any questions? Anything like that?
It's interesting to think about, I don't have many kids or whatever, and as they know, 8 kids specifically, and you think about how your kids are socialized really early on. And I know we've talked about this a little bit, but even from the youngest of ages, and the parents don't realize, we don't quite realize what we're doing, but when kids are curious, 2 or 3-year-old, right? Mommy, why is he black? Why is he, whatever? And you're afraid of, even in public, oh gosh, hold on, you're not supposed to say that, whatever. And I think that I was kind of getting a sense of where does that division, describe, where's that sense of being different, whatever. And I think that in some ways, we, as parents, unintentionally stifle curiosity in young kids that is just natural and good, by our fears and by our worries that it's violating some kind of public, what we're supposed to act or whatever. And so we shut things down. And by shutting things down, we instantly send the message that that's an off-limits kind of discussion.
Yeah.
And you're like, but it's not an off-limits discussion. It shouldn't be an off-limits discussion. And so much of, of course, as psychologists, we can't help but think of it, but we think about the way that our kids are socialized, and we think about, it really begins early on. Are these conversations relevant? Are they okay? Are these, is it reasonable? And before we know it, I think our kids step into, kindergarten, 1st grade, and they've already kind of been socialized about what this is, right? They're different. Now again, we have a climate, and I'll share this later if we have some time, about something I tried to do a few years ago, and I hit that same situation you described where people are afraid, and I get that. You're afraid of saying something that will immediately cancel or brand you, and it shuts down conversations. But I actually think that happens really at the beginning of life. And it just kind of matriculates its way all the way up through us as adults, right? We're grown kids, so. But I don't know what your thoughts are about that. So.
So what I say is, think about it this way. That pattern obviously was formed a long time ago, right? But we don't have the luxury, and I'm not that you're saying this at all, we don't have the luxury of saying, oh, it's uncomfortable, this is how I am, right? Because it's not going to get better.
Right.
It's not going to get better, right? Just because it's not in the media right now doesn't mean it's getting better. It's not getting better at all, right? And just because there isn't an episode doesn't mean there isn't a lack of trust. There is a lack of trust. And because there's a lack of trust, socially, our relationships are very fragile. Does that make sense? If all it takes is just one episode, and then we'll have a Floyd again, right? So I have, so I have to say to myself, you know what, it's difficult, but I'll do the work. And what I found is, people want to be talked to. I mean, you guys know the easiest way to ask them a question about themselves, and we'll go at it. But yeah, so we have to build those relationships. The number one problem with racial disunity is not inequity. The number one problem is lack of kinship, is that I don't see that person as myself. And it's not enough to say, oh, they're like me. I have to get to discover that they are like me.
Oh, I was gonna say, I kind of have an example. So my son, he's 4, and I have a friend that has 1 arm. And I hadn't really brought up the conversation with him. He's been around her before because I'm so used to her, I don't even see it. And so when he started asking me, like we play t-ball, and it was like, he kept asking me, he really, really was interested. And I was like, well, I was trying to tell him about it, and I was like, you know what? So I called her and I said, Roman, we had about a 15-minute conversation. I should have talked to him about it earlier, but I didn't even think of it. He's asking about your arm. So next week he might come up to you and ask you about it. What way should this is what I've explained to him. He still has some questions about it. How did you talk to August and Annie, her children, about it? Roman might ask you about it next week. So I think if we approach something like that, I have that relationship with her already. So I feel comfortable going to her and saying, do you want to talk to Roman about it? Or Roman was saying this about it. So if we had a conversation, if we felt that comfortable with people, then I feel like children would have more opportunity for openness.
Absolutely. Something I tell people is, especially culturally, one of the approaches we've taken is to say, is to not see color, right? We don't want to see the ethnicity of the other person. Something I tell people is, that's impossible. That's impossible. You have to see the other person's ethnicity. You have to see forget the fact that their skin color is more than their skin color, right? It talks about it's their history, it's their culture. I'm like, forget about that. You just need to see their skin color. Because I'm like, well, for starters, I'd be worried, is there something wrong with your eyes, right? But number 2, the reason why we've come up with that solution, the reason why we've come up is because we think it's a solution, right? Or for me to treat you as equal, because there's a break in relationship, for me to be fair to you, I should ignore the fact that you're different from me. The problem is not that I see ethnicity, whiteness, brownness. The problem is what I see when I see that. Does that make sense? So if I see a white person, if I'm walking on the street and I see a white older lady, okay, and I think to myself, oh, she's seeing me, she's going across the street. What does that reflect? Does that reflect something about that woman, or does that reflect something about me? It doesn't reflect anything about the lady. It reflects something about me, right? If she's looking at me and she says, oh, there goes the black guy, and we're the only ones in the street, I'm going to cross. That doesn't reflect anything about me. It reflects something about her. It reflects what she thinks, or it reflects what she sees when she sees black. If I get pulled over by a cop, and the minute he gets up his car, I'm like, oh, he's white and he's male, and I start panicking, that doesn't reveal anything about that police officer at all. That reveals something about me. It reveals what blue and white and the sirens trigger when I see them. It reveals something about me. So not seeing a person's color is not a solution. Is not a solution for equity. The solution is to see that person for what they are, to celebrate what they are, to recognize their shortcomings, just like I have shortcomings, and to value them. Right? So one of the things we tell people is, when I'm talking in a Christian setting, is I tell people, if God made someone a certain way, and everything God does is good, then if God made that person white, there's something good about being white. Right? There's something good about being white. If I look at a white person and I don't see that good thing, the problem's not with them, the problem's with me. And the same is true for anyone who looks at a drug trafficker or gangster or whatever. I'm like, the problem's not with me, the problem's with you. But I recognize what you're being fed. So I have some role in correcting that. I'll take it upon myself. I once told a friend, I was like, listen, the certain parts of the country I lived in, and the times when I'd be walking, and I would see someone of a different ethnicity, and I would cross the street. And I crossed the street because I knew they were uncomfortable. So I was like, I crossed the street so that they don't have to embarrass themselves or be uncomfortable. And someone said, Ubi, that's not fair. And I said, yeah, I recognize it's not fair, but I recognize it's life. That's where we are right now. So, to make you comfortable, I'll do that. When I have the time or the opportunity, I'll do something in my power to help correct that. Does that mean, like, I have to take ownership. I have a role to play. Right? So with the people you work with, what role do you have to play? What can you do? Right? In the Bible, there's a place that says, hey, if you're bringing something to worship God, okay, and while you're about to give your offering to God, you remember that somebody has something against you. It says, leave your offering, go and be reconciled to that person, and then come back and give your offering. And that speaks, in the Bible, that speaks to the importance of reconciliation and relationship over any form of religiosity. And this, interestingly, the same is true in real life. The same is true in real life. What am I celebrating when I know someone else has something against me? What am I doing to correct that? So we see that the problem is loss of kinship, and we see that the solution is reconciliation. Not abandoning one policy, but building relationship. And it starts with simply having those hard conversations. I tell people all the time, I've been with people who have said things and asked me things that would be considered extremely offensive. Right? I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, when I moved from Washington, D.C. to Evansville, I was staying with some friends. I was attending a school here, and all the guys stayed in the same housing. Fast forward 3 years later, I was a third-year student. A first-year student comes in, and he's lived in as rural America as you can get. Okay, and he comes to Evansville. For him, Evansville is a big city. This kid. Okay, so you get where I'm coming from. And so we've been together in the house for maybe a few months or so, and I'm in charge of, I'm responsible for mentoring this kid. So one day we are sitting down watching TV, and this kid, he is just looking at me. And he keeps on looking at me. And so eventually I'm like, yo, why are you looking at me? And he's like, hey, Ubi, can I touch your hair? And everything in me is like, what? He's like, yeah, man, can I touch your hair? I say, sure, you can touch my hair. So it's very uncomfortable. But I bend down, let the guy touch me, and he's like, thank you very much. I'm like, okay, cool. You can tell he's excited. 2 weeks later, we're sitting down talking, and he's looking at me again. I'm like, darn it, what's good? I'm not allowed to say darn it, I'm sorry. and he's like, I'm like, why are you looking at me? He's like, Ubi, I was just wondering. I was like, what? He says, my skin is white. I was like, yes, I can see that. this guy's a full-grown adult. He's like maybe 21, 22, okay? He's like, Ubi, my skin is white. I'm like, yes, I can see that. He's like, and the soles of my feet are white. I'm like, I can see that too. And he says, Ubi, you're black. I say, yes, but the soles of your feet are white. I'm like, yes. He says, why? I'm like, you really expect me to explain to you why the soles of my feet are lighter? I'm like, I have no idea why. You know, we all start laughing. But the point I'm making is, later on, when we're graduating, this kid comes up to me and says, Ubi, thank you so much for letting me ask you some of the most ridiculous questions. You were a safe place for me. There were other conversations we had that centered around race and his family that were very, very personal. But it was interesting. I didn't know this then, but he was priming me. Hey, Ubi, can I touch your hair? Hey, Ubi, can I look at the sole of your feet? Right? What he discovered was, what he was doing was, is this guy safe? Is he a safe place? And I allowed him to ask and do those things because I was like, I don't think, you know, I'm going to give you the benefit of doubt. I don't think you're a hateful person. You could just be curious. And sure enough, he was. But because I let him do those things, then we started having some serious, you know, like inner working kind of conversations. But the point I'm making is, when I let him touch my hair and even ask me that question, that was very difficult, right? Living in a place like Atlanta for a number of years, then moving to DC, then moving to Evansville, and being asked, can I touch your hand? Why, you know, I could have said that's very offensive, right? But I recognize, hey, this guy's lost to me. This kid may have not met 5 black people in his lifetime. In his lifetime. Right? Again, that's, you know, you might say, well, Ubi, what about those times when the person really is ignorant, really is unfair, right? Really is partial? Well, in those times, again, that reflects something about the person. For someone to be that wicked, what it elicits from me is pity. When I look at a hateful person, I shouldn't feel hatred. What I should feel is mercy. Because something happens to a person for a person to get that hateful. The average healthy person doesn't just wake out of bed one day, right, and do things like that or say things like that. Something has happened. And I may not be, you know, a psychologist, I may not be an expert, but I'm normal enough to know that that person is lost to me. And that the little I can do to heal that person is love them, is to actually hear and give them grace, right? So the solution is not seeing a person's ethnicity. You need to see the person's ethnicity, but what you should ask yourself is, what am I seeing? What am I seeing? And if I'm seeing something that's off, then that's something that I need to work on. You know, you might be, you know, you might be afraid of, man, what if I use the wrong word? Should, you know, we have conversations like, is it okay to use the N word? Is it not okay to use the N word? You know, is white privilege real? Is white privilege not real? I'm like, those things ultimately don't matter if you're working to build a relationship. Right? Because here's what we know. I bet you some of you in this room know black people who don't have a problem with the N-word being used around them. But I bet you in this room that you know black people that have a problem with the N-word being used around them. So, when do you not use the N-word? Right? Now the general rule is to be safe. Hey, don't use the N-word. That's the general rule, right? But on a relational basis, when do you know that it's okay and when do you know it's not okay? Or what happens if you hear it said among a group of people and they seem to be okay with it and now you are completely thrown off because you haven't thought to build a relationship? The point I'm making is those things are discovered in the relationship. Right? Those things are discovered. I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I was meeting with a friend. This was during COVID. Downtown Evansville was shut down completely. Right? Downtown Evansville. Let me know when I'm running out of time.
No, I was stop it.
Okay.
Continue. Anybody who wants to leave, definitely. Thank you so much.
downtown Evansville shut down. But I was thinking with this friend, a white gentleman, we're gonna have coffee. And we're gonna walk down to the riverfront. I was like, dude, why walk down to the riverfront? We can sit right here. It's a Comfort Inn on Main and Third, I think, right? They were closed. But we sat on the balcony and we were there for probably about 2.5 hours, just talking, planning for an event. When we were leaving, I said to him, you know that I would never in 1,000 years have suggested we sit down in the patio of a closed business in downtown Evansville if you were black. And he said, what? I said, yeah. And while we were there, a number of people that drove by and they looked at us more than once. The police officer that time had driven by 4 times, and every time he looked at us, right? And he's like, Ubi, that's horrible. And I was like, no. That's the way it is. But what we did was, I said, you notice we didn't get stopped. And I think, I could be wrong, I think the reason we didn't get stopped is because you're white. But I don't have a problem with it because that's the reality. Guess what we did? We basically just used your whiteness, right, to sit down and fellowship and plan for an event. So it all worked out, right? The point I'm making is, I don't have the time or the energy, right, to look into a dictionary to discover what words need to be used or what words need not be used, what issues are kosher and what issues are not kosher. I would rather expend my energy in building relationship with you. And if I find that something is real and true, the question I ask is, how can we use this to foster our relationship, right? It's like taking someone into maybe a black neighborhood who has never been in a black neighborhood. You know what I would do? I would do everything in my power to make them feel comfortable and to make sure they're fine, make sure that it was a nice experience for them. Why? Because, why do I think I can do that? Because I'm black, because I know the neighborhood. Does that make sense? Right? So if you came thinking, oh, we're going to define certain words and understand, I'm like, no, we're not going to do that, because here's what happens. New words come up, right? New words come up, and then conversations come around those words. Should we use them? Should we not use them? Where should we use them? So instead, what I do is, instead of focusing on words, let's focus on the principle. The principle is, the solution is reconciliation, building relationships. The problem is lack of kinship, right? So I try to, I work to build relationship, and because we build relationship, when we come across inequities, we fix them, right? We put laws and policies in place, and those laws and policies in place are kept because relationship exists, not because. So at the end of the day, what a law does is tell me wrong from right. That law itself has no power to change me. When I'm driving and I see 70 miles an hour, that sign does not have the capacity to make me drive slower, right? Now, if there's a police car parked by that sign, it probably would. But guess what? I would only drive 70 until I was past that car. Like, laws and policies have there's no way. But if I'm driving 70 miles an hour, and I spoke to my wife, and she's worried, she's like, babe, please be careful. We want you to come home. Guess what I'm going to do? When there's no police officer around and I see that 70 miles an hour and I see myself going over 70 and I think about my wife, I'm going to be like, yeah, you need to settle down, you need to get home. She's worried about you, right? That's just relationships to that. So, so basically this is just a primer really to help you lay out a framework saying, okay, hey, when we're talking about racial reconciliation or racial tension, right? Before I get caught up in law and policy, maybe what I should be focusing on is relationship, right? I'll give you just one.
Go ahead.
No.
If you don't need
No,
it, go ahead.
no.
I'd love to hear it.
Just in conclusion, just to repeat, kinship, reconciliation, right? Loss in relationship is what leads to inequity. So restore relationship. That requires being transparent. It requires talking, and those are not things that you necessarily need to be taught. You can talk and you can be honest. It's hard, but you have to do it because what we're facing is a whole lot harder than just, I'd rather have a conversation with someone, have a difficult conversation, than not have that conversation and then face something much harder later on, right? So with that in mind, I just want to share with you guys, my organization, Lock United, we've been hosting an event every Saturday in May, the last 3 years. It's called the Prism and Light Experience, and what we do is, it's specifically for Christians, but everyone's invited. What we do is we pair you with someone of a different ethnicity, and we say, we want you to have coffee for an hour and a half together. Nothing is off the table. So the first Saturday we have a workshop and symposium where I give this talk, but it's more like a lecture, right? We have a workshop, we have a seminar. Then the next Saturday we have coffee for two. We pair you with someone of a different ethnicity, and we say, we want you to meet for an hour and a half. Nothing is off the table. We'll give you 2 questions, and we say, we just want you to take 30 minutes to discuss these questions. Outside of that, you can talk about anything else. The second Saturday, or the third Saturday, we'll pair you with someone of a different ethnicity, and you guys will either serve someone or do a community project together. The fourth Saturday, we have a festival with music and games and hot dog and that kind of stuff. And those people that participated could actually come and serve at the event and get to share the experience. So it's every May. So our very first one is May the 6th, 9 a.m. at the Innovation Point downtown. So you guys are welcome to come. You can find information on my website. It is lockunited.org, LOCKunited.org. Just go to events and you'll see the information. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it a lot, and sharing your time. And really, I would just want to say on behalf of the group too, I think sharing your safe space too, it is